Hey, how about that? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Nick, and we want to welcome you to the online gathering of the Pathways Church community. And here we are in the month of June, and we are celebrating our graduates. I cannot believe that we are at the end of the school year. It feels to me like this school year just started and we're already at the end. And for some people in our group, that means that this is the end not just of another school year, but the end of their high school careers. And so we want to say a special congratulations to those of you who are graduating this year. We want you to know that we are super proud of you. This is a huge milestone. It's a big deal to complete this part of your education and move on to the next chapter. And we want to celebrate with you. And in our in-person gatherings today, we're actually celebrating the graduates who are there. We're throwing ourselves a little bit of a party for them. And even though you're in the virtual world here today, join us in sending out a prayer for these graduates as they head off into the next chapter of their lives. Now, today you have joined on here with the online gathering of the Pathways Church community, and if you don't know a lot about us and want to get to know more about us, you can do that by going to our website at findpathways.com, and on that site you can browse around a little bit and read some of the words that we use to describe ourselves, and perhaps that will help you get a little better sense of what type of community this is. We have our core values listed in the bottom of the screen here, the corner of the screen, and those are things, values that we have decided on this journey together in faith. We kind of see it as a pilgrimage, as a journey, as a hike together. The destination, I suppose, is out there, but the journey is clearly as important as the destination. And along this journey, we want to make sure and slow down and value some things along the way, things that God uses to help us to become the very best versions of humanity that we could possibly be, to become, frankly, more like Him. And so if you want to read up more on those core values, you can do that on our website as well. Now, we often describe ourselves with two words. The two words are cautious and curious. And just as a way to get to know us, it's kind of a helpful little elevator pitch of like, who is this group? What am I getting myself into here? We're cautious. We find ourselves as a group of people who are, I suppose, religious. I mean, this is sort of a religious engagement that we're a part of here. But we find ourselves being a little cautious about organized religion. Many of us have grown up in religious environments, and we've seen religion used in some ways that are very helpful and beneficial. But we've also seen religion used in some ways that is harmful and abusive and exclusive. And we notice that religion tends to trend that way. And so we find ourselves being a little cautious of organized religion, while, yes, I understand living in this tension here of being organized religiously and also being a little skeptical of organized religion. It makes us cautious. Now, we live in that tension. We also live in a tension of not having all the answers, which makes us sort of curious. We're fine not having all the answers. We actually think as a community here that having all the right or correct answers isn't even actually the point. But because we are not always sure of all the right answers, we're curious. We're always questioning things. We're re-examining things that we perhaps believed previously or believe currently, and are trying to re-examine them to discover if there is a healthier, better, more Christ-like way of thinking about things. And so we're always asking a lot of questions here, and we think that's good, we think that's healthy, and we think that questioning things is not in any way threatening to God Himself. So that are the two words that we use to describe ourselves, cautious and curious, and if those in any way kind of resonate with you, then this might be a group that you want to check out a little further. Now, as for what we're going to be doing in this online thing here today, we're going to start with a little bit of singing. Billy, our worship leader, is going to come on the screen. He's going to lead us in two songs. Sandwiched in the middle is a little reflective video, and this is to help us engage in worship this morning. Some of you, this is your church service. It's not, you don't go regularly in person somewhere. You live in different areas. And so this is a kind of an aspect of worshiping that you can engage in here. And then when that is done, I'm going to come back on the screen, and we're going to finish out our series on violence in the Bible. How do we match up the violence that we see in the Bible with the peace-loving, love your neighbors Jesus of the New Testament? And we got just a kind of final thing to kind of wrap up that series today. And then we are going to finish with a time of communion. Now, in our in-person gatherings, we take communion together. Two elements, the bread and the cup. They represent the body and the blood of Jesus. It's a way for us to weekly memorialize Jesus' death, his burial, and then ultimately celebrate his resurrection. And there's nothing magical about these things, but it is a sacred moment because it gives us time to recalibrate, to remember how Jesus overcame evil, and it becomes a pledge for us to commit to overcome evil in the same way. Now, in this online experience, we can't provide those elements for you, so if you want to participate in communion, you can do that by going and finding a couple items that you might need to participate. First of all, you need something for the bread. So if you want to find a cracker or a small piece of bread, you're welcome to use something like that. And for the cup, maybe find some juice in the fridge, or perhaps you have some wine left over from last night. You can pour a little bit of that, and that would be perfect for this as well. Okay? And then finally, we will just wrap up with some announcements at the end. And we've got a few kind of good announcements, important announcements for the summer that are worth sticking around for to find out at the end. Okay, now, why don't we just jump right into things? Billy, our worship leader, will lead us off in some music here, and I'll see you back on the screen in just a few moments. All right, let's worship.
Presence, we respond to your great love. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. We don't want anything but you. Our beloved Jesus, we just want to see you in the glory of your light. Earthly things don't matter, they just fade and shatter when we're touched by love divine. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. And we don't want anything but you. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. We don't want anything but you. Anything but you, God. Here we go, let's go to the throne, place that we belong, right into his arms. Here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms, yeah. Here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms. Yeah, here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms. Here we go, let's go to the throne, a place that we belong, right into his arms. Oh, here we go, let's go to the throne, a place that we belong, right into his arms. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. See, we won't be satisfied. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. And we don't want anything but you. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. And we don't want anything but you. Oh, we won't be satisfied. We won't be satisfied. Oh, anything but you. Earthly things don't matter, they just fade and shatter when we're touched by love divine.
As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because a servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another.
I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, Lord, turn lives around. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, mending every heart. I worship you. I worship you. 'Cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. 'Cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Oh, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Yes, you are waymaker, waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Oh, that is who you are. 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 Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop, you never stop working. You never stop, you never stop working. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the dark. is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are.
But that's not, in a Trinitarian sort of orthodox view of this, that's not God's little boy on the cross. That's God. That's actually God. That's the second person of the Trinity. That's God taking in all of humanity's broken ass stuff, all of our sin, our brokenness, our need for vengeance, the fact that we want to use power against other people, the fact that, we want to be the empire now, all of that, like all that violence and affliction and sin of humanity, and somehow took that into God's own broken human body, and then gave us just forgiveness. Like when Jesus says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they're doing," that is an eternally valid statement. So,
what do you mean?
I mean, that is still true today, right? Like, God took all of that sin upon God's own broken body, and then in response gave us nothing but forgiveness and blessedness and resurrection. And something was accomplished. To me, something was accomplished there that is for all people and all things and all of creation. I think it's God's nature to redeem us and all of creation continually. And God's working that out. Even if we don't see it all the time, that's God's work and God's nature.
It's good news.
That feels like good news to me. And I see it. I mean, I still see it. And the thing is that being people who have received that kind of grace and forgiveness, sometimes we get to be ones who are agents of that in the world. The world's just a mess, right? Sometimes being people who have been forgiven and have received this grace and mercy, we get to bring that into the world. Now, not in this like we're the holy agents of all things good. It's
Or we're
almost
going to forgive ISIS or anything.
right.
Come on, silly goose.
But it's almost accidental. It's like it creates these openings in us from which that stuff flows despite us. I've seen it over and over. I mean, so you say, what do Christians do in the world? We accidentally, despite ourselves, get to be agents of forgiveness and mercy and grace because we've been cracked open, and then that just stuff flows out. It's just God's stuff. It flows out. It's not because of a plan we have or a discipleship group or whatever. It's just we're these sort of broken and healed people from which that stuff comes out.
What is God's stuff?
All of it. I mean, all of that love and mercy and it's so destabilizing and it's so against human nature. That's the thing that's so redemptive about it. It's like the antidote to who we are naturally that we need.
Oh, love that. Nadia Bolts there talking about forgiveness and how it is the antidote to our brokenness. And that is just a great little intro into what we're going to talk about today, which is forgiveness. Now, before we get there, though, I'll talk about a place here that there isn't a lot of forgiveness, and that is sports. Now, newsflash, I am a big sports fan. I love sports, love football, basketball, to a lesser degree, baseball, love golf. I mean, I just love sports. They're a lot of fun. I like watching them on TV. I like listening to sports radio and hearing all the drama in sports. Just love it. The one thing I've noticed about sports, particularly over the last few years, I maybe have become more sensitive to it, is that there is a lot of kind of violent war or battle lingo that is used in sports. Sports athletes often use warrior language to talk about their competitiveness or the activities that they're involved in. You get teammates together to say, we're getting everybody together, we're going to war together. We're going to battle together. And they don't mean they're actually going to fight a war. They mean they're going to go play a game against another team, right? Or you hear things like, well, one man goes down, it's just next man up, which is kind of battlefield lingo. You'll hear players talking when nobody seems to believe in them and only they believe in themselves and things are coming at them pretty difficult. And they say, well, we just have to have a bunker mentality. Or you'll see one player in an interview talking about his teammates, and then the reporter will ask him, what kind of team atmosphere they have, and you'll hear the player say, I'd go to war with any of these guys any day. Now, sports is just kind of famous for this, for using war lingo or battle language in the discussion of sports. Sports borrow a lot of language from the battlefield, particularly football. You think about all sorts of lingo in football, like throwing a deep bomb or blitzing the quarterback, or coaches will talk about meeting the other player at the point of attack, or even punt cover specialists are called gunners. I mean, there's just a few examples of a ton of battle lingo and language that is incorporated in just football alone. And while sports obviously are physical or can be physical, sports, full contact sports like football and basketball and soccer and things like that, when athletes are using this language, they don't actually mean that they're wanting to go out and kill someone. Well, at least I don't think they do most of the time. But they're describing a mindset of competition. And they're using these familiar concepts of battle to illustrate their feelings about the competition they're about to engage in. Now, today, what I want us to see here in our series is that New Testament authors, and actually even Jesus himself, do something sort of similar. They borrow some visual components from their cultural surroundings around them, some of which include some violent imagery to communicate the broader message that they're trying to get across. Now, we're doing a series here that we're finishing up finally today called Construction Zone. This is season 2 of this particular series. In the first season, we dealt with the Bible material, and we were rethinking what is the Bible itself. In this season, we're rethinking violence that we read about in the Bible. Particularly, we've been talking about how do you reconcile the violence in the Old Testament that is condoned. Sometimes it appears to be apparently commanded by God. How do you reconcile that violence that includes attempted genocide? How do you reconcile that with the love your enemies teaching of Jesus in the New Testament? And we have covered a lot in this series. There's probably some good stuff worth going back and looking at if you haven't seen all of it. And I think that the repudiation of violence in the New Testament is actually really central to Jesus' message. I don't think it's sort of a side issue with Jesus. It appears to be pretty central. But mostly in this series, we've spoken of the Old Testament because that's where the violence is commanded or condoned by God, at least on the surface. Now, the New Testament doesn't have that same type of violence, but it does use some familiar pictures that are at times violent on the face of them to make a point, especially as this relates to God's judgment. We don't have anybody in the New Testament commanding people to go out and fight or kill people, but we do have pictures of God and his judgment that sound a little violent. Derek Flood, in his book Disarming Scripture, says it this way. In broad terms, we might say that while the Old Testament commands humans to commit violence in God's name, including attempted genocide, the New Testament categorically forbids this for the people of God. If there is an issue of violence in the New Testament at all, it is not one of humans committing violence in God's name, but rather the issue of God's violence expressed in the form of divine judgment. And I think that's really true, and so I wanted to spend just our last message here on this violence addressing some of these pictures, these violent pictures of God's judgment that we see in the New Testament. Now, one of the most obvious places, if we're going to talk about God's judgment in the New Testament, one of the most obvious places that we could turn to talk about this would be, of course, the book of Revelation, which is the final book of the New Testament. And there is clearly some violent imagery there, and we could spend some time going through that, but it turns out we already did. We did a whole series on the book of Revelation not long ago, talking about how all of Revelation is symbolism and not to be taken literally. It's actually a subversive form of anti-imperialist satire aimed at the power of Rome. It is not a roadmap for how the world is going to end one day, and it should not be read literally looking for those things. It's all symbology that is poking some satire fun at the empire of Rome. So, 666 has nothing to do with the devil, and Revelation isn't written to warn you about getting microchipped at some point in the future. You may not want to do that, but that's not what Revelation is about. So, if you're interested in the book of Revelation, though, we recently did a series on that a couple years back, and I'll just go ahead and let you look that up online and watch it if you're interested. And we just won't address that here today since we spent so much time on it earlier. Instead, what I'd like to do is look at another example, and that is, as we're talking about God's judgment, some examples of Jesus' actual words, specifically as we find them in the parables. And I'd like to use today a good example of one of these parables that will help us unpack how this violent imagery of God's judgment looks in the New Testament and why we might want to be careful in interpreting it too literally or too stringently. Now, there are several parables that have a sort of violent imagery as related to God's judgment. For instance, one of them is known pretty well. It's in Matthew 25. It's the parable of the sheep and the goats. Perhaps you're familiar with that one. Jesus is separating at the end of time. He says here, people on his left and people on his right, the sheep and the goats. And he's basically, the criteria he says is, did you care for the least of these? Those who are hungry and thirsty, did you feed them, give them water? Those in jail, did you visit them? Those who were naked, did you provide them clothing? And this is the basis for this ultimate judgment here of those on his left and those on his right. And he's wondering, did you take care of the least of these? And then the answer at the end is, if not, at the end of the parable, it says that those who did not take care of the least of these are thrown into the eternal fire and tormented forever. So, we have a little bit of a violent image here of God's judgment. But I want to look at a different one today that I think relates the same way as the sheep and the goats does, but it'll give us kind of a format here for thinking about some of these things. And that is the parable of the unforgiving servant. Now, we're going to unpack this, but first of all, I'd like to point out that parables are actually a really good place to start here because generally people read a lot more into parables than they're actually intended to mean. It's become very popular to read a lot into a parable, particularly more than the intended story is meant to convey. And you may have read this particular one or may be aware of it as we begin to read it and been a little bothered by at least part of the story, particularly the end conclusion, due to the imagery that we find there. Now, secondly, I'd like to point out that this parable is in the Gospel of Matthew. And that's important because it's actually been noted that Matthew's gospel stands out kind of on its own in its usage of more violent language. There's times in the Gospel of Matthew where it says, Jesus says, and they will be thrown out into the outer darkness and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It doesn't sound like a very pleasant experience. And it might be important for you to know that no other gospel includes these phrases. And Matthew's gospel includes parables that rely on this language and use some violent imagery. And that has led many people to conclude that since these things don't exist in the other gospel, that perhaps Matthew is inserting some of this language on his own. Remember, Gospels aren't biographies the way that we think of them. They've been carefully shaped theologically. They're sort of biased biographies. And some scholars have then decided, because Matthew includes this violent imagery that the others don't, that perhaps he has inserted it himself, or that Matthew has sort of fundamentally misunderstood what Jesus was trying to say in certain areas. Now, I think that's an interesting idea, and I wanted to just mention it to you here. But we won't address that much today. I just wanted to kind of throw it out there. But let's just look at this parable as we get started here. Let's read it together, talk about it, and I think you'll see maybe an unflattering picture at the end, and we'll talk about how do we make sense of that. Okay, let's read the story of the unforgiving servant. It's in Matthew 18. It starts in verse 21 with sort of a preamble. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had to be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told the master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? And in his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Okay, you familiar with this one? This is the parable of the unforgiving servant. It starts with the king who, for the purposes of the story that Jesus is telling here, represents God. And this king finds a servant that owes him a lot of money. And you say, well, how much is it? Well, the NIV text told us here that he owes him 10,000 bags of gold. But if if you have your actual Bible open and you drop down, you'll probably notice there's a footnote there. And the footnote there is letting you know what the actual Greek terms were here. It's not 10,000 bags of gold. That's a nice way of the translators trying to make it have some sort of sense to us as English readers in the 21st century. But in Greek, the actual words there are 10,000 talents. And both of these words, 10,000 and talents, are actually important to the story. It might be helpful to know that 10,000 was the largest numeral in the Greek language, myrios. Now, I believe Roman numerals went up to 100,000, but in Greek numerals, really 10,000 was the biggest one, myrios. It was the biggest number you could think of. In fact, myrios, the term 10,000, actually eventually became to mean infinite or limitless or without end, because it was sort of the largest number you could think of. And so Jesus is using a term here that represents the largest number in the Greek language. Now, 10,000 is the largest number in the Greek language, but a talent is also important because a talent was the highest unit of currency. And it was basically 20 years worth of the daily wage, which is called a denarii. 20 years worth of salary, okay? So Jesus says, here's a man who owes 10,000 times 20 years of salary, which that means that is 65 million denarii, or about 200,000 years wages. That is how much this guy owes. It is the highest number you can think of times the largest currency in existence. All right, that is what Jesus basically says here. That is how much he owes. The largest number you can think of times the largest currency in existence. And the whole point here is that it's a comical amount. I mean, it's basically like Jesus said, and he owed him a bajillion zillion dollars. That is what Jesus is saying here. It's an absurd amount. It's sort of an exaggerated amount. It's intended to be comical. And the whole point is here, this is an impossible debt to pay back, okay? Especially not in jail. But you couldn't pay it back even if you weren't in jail. And you remember here, the man says, just be patient with me, I'll pay it all back. And that's the comedy of the whole story at this point, is because even if he wanted to, there'd be no way to pay back a debt this big. Okay, so in the story though, Jesus says that the king, who represents God here, forgives him and lets him go. And I love this picture of God, right? God is it's so good right here at the beginning. God forgives the impossible debt. Don't you love that picture of God? I mean, that you have created a debt so big that you could never pay it back. But God forgives it. I mean, it's a story that is highlighting the graciousness, the deep mercy of God. He is willing to forgive beyond what is even reasonable. No one forgives more than God. He is the model of forgiveness. And that is a key part of this parable. God forgives the biggest debt imaginable. Now, the next part of the story is highlighting a comparison. The king, remember, representing God here, has forgiven this impossible amount. I mean, he's forgiven more than anyone could possibly forgive. But in the next part, the forgiven servant goes out and finds one of his own servants who owes him some money. But it's much less money. Verse 28 tells us that he found a servant who owed him 100 silver coins. Now, 100 silver coins. Again, that's our translators trying to help us in English in the 21st century understand this a little bit better. But in Greek, we have two words here again. It is 100 denarii. Remember, the denarii is a daily wage. So this is 100 days' wages, which is basically about 3 months' salary, a little more than 3 months' salary, which is not nothing, but it's pennies compared to the giant bazillion dollars that the forgiven servant owed the king. And yet, even though by comparison this is such a smaller debt, this forgiven servant refuses to extend that forgiveness to his servant, the same forgiveness that the king has extended to him. Now, as with most parables, there is a comparison happening here, okay, that we should see, that Jesus intends for us to see. God forgives much, but this servant won't even forgive a little. And the point is, that's silly, right? I mean, the point of this whole thing is you should be more like God. Forgive more. God has forgiven so much. How is it that we find ourselves unwilling to forgive others so little? People whose debts to us are much less in comparison to what God has forgiven us. Now, they're not nothing, right? We don't want to minimize that people may have harmed us or taken advantage of us or whatever else. We don't want to minimize that. It's not that it's nothing, but in comparison to how generous God is with forgiveness, the question there in this comparison is, why are we so stingy? It's a pretty good little barb to this story, isn't it? All that's good. So far, so good. But now the story ends with the king hearing about the original servant's unwillingness to forgive, and calling him back, he rebukes him for his lack of compassion on his own servant, and he throws him in jail and has him tortured. And the story ends with verse 35, and this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Yikes. And verse 35 here becomes, really, and 34, become the problem with this story. It's not calling for humans to commit violence, but it seems to portray a God and his judgment that seems, well, rather unbecoming. I mean, will God actually torture us if we don't forgive others? And so this story, the end of the parable, kind of presents a violent picture of God, not calling for humans to do violence like we read in the Old Testament, but read from our perspective, it sure does feel like God himself is quite violent. So what do we make of stories like this parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew? Well, let me help you understand parables a little bit here today, and perhaps that will help us wrap our minds a little bit around what is going on in this particular story. So let me give you a couple things here that I call plotting the parables, right? Plotting our way around the parables, understanding the main plot of the story, and some helpful tips on how to read parables in general, but then let's apply them to this specific one as well. And the first main thing is this. Parables generally have one main point. Now, it's important to stop here for a moment and notice that parables are usually intended to have only one main point. Usually something subversive that causes you to rethink something that you thought you knew. And that is why Jesus tells these parables to cause you to think, right? It's this clever, subversive way that Jesus has of causing you to reflect on something that you thought you were pretty sure about, but now that he tells the story, you're like, oh, I think I see what he's getting at here, right? Now, the story has a lot of details, all the parables do, that aren't necessarily part of the main point. They just kind of go to service the story itself, setting people in the cultural reality that they are familiar with. But you can't get hung up on these little details. It's the main point is what matters. Now today, I know lots of people like to pick through the parables and assign meaning to every single detail, right? But that is not how the ancients thought about parables. They had one main point. And when we get away from the main point of the story, things start to get a little bit weird. Now, we've already identified in our parable here kind of the main point. Main point appears to be God has forgiven a debt that is so large it could never be repaid. He is absurdly generous in his forgiveness. Therefore, we should forgive others with the same generosity of forgiveness. Okay? That seems to be the main point here. That appears to even be the reason for the parable. It's about forgiveness and how forgiveness goes beyond what you think is reasonable. Notice how it starts. Peter, there's a little preamble here. Peter is actually asking Jesus a question, and his question has to do with, how many times should I have to forgive people? Up to 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, 77 times. You see, Peter comes with a question here. That's the whole reason for the story. He's just wanting to know the limits of forgiveness. How far should I go to forgive people? How often should I do it? I mean, should I do it another time? If they screw up, should I do it a 3rd time? And he throws out a number there that probably he assumes is a large number. It's in Hebrew, it would be the sort of the number of completion, right? Like the complete amount. 7 times? Hey, he probably ready to pat himself on the back thinking like, Jesus is going to love this answer. But Jesus says, that's a nice number, Peter, but no, it's way more than that. It's way beyond what you are imagining. And then he says, let me tell you a story. And then he tells the story of a king who forgives an unforgivable debt and the forgiven servant who doesn't learn the lesson and act the same way. And in this entire parable, what Jesus is doing is he is answering the question of how many times should I forgive, with a story about radical forgiveness that goes beyond the bounds of what seems reasonable. It's a story that's intended to cause Peter to rethink how far forgiveness can and should go. And that is the main point or reason for the story. Now, there are other details in the story that don't necessarily go toward that main point. They end up just kind of contextualizing this whole story in the ancient world that these people knew. But we should be very careful about pressing those details too far or forming some sort of theology of God around these other details that are simply context for the story. And that brings us to the second plot point of parables, that minor details shouldn't be pushed too far. With parables, we look for a main point because they're metaphors. We're trying to understand what is this metaphor's main point. Metaphors are comparison. You know, this thing over here is like that thing over there. It's the laying side by side of 2 things and noticing their comparisons. In fact, that's actually what the word parable means. It means to lay alongside something else. And that can be a very useful tool, but no metaphor is perfect. Metaphors help us compare big ideas, and we can see some similarities that help us think outside of the box. But all metaphors, if they're pushed too far, they become absurd. And in fact, if we put too much pressure on some of the minor details of the parable story that is a metaphor, or if we push too far on a metaphor in real life, we end up with conclusions sometimes that are in fact the exact opposite of the main point of the metaphor in the first place. You know, I always think of Shakespeare, who wrote that Juliet is like the sun, right? Those are Romeo's words. Juliet is like the sun. And Juliet is being compared to the sun because the sun provides light and warmth and is beautiful. And that is how Romeo feels about Juliet. But, how far do you want to push that metaphor? Because at night, the sun goes away. You say, well, one thing I know about the sun, every night it sets and it's gone all during the night. And so does that mean that Romeo loses his feelings for Juliet during the middle of the night, that he no longer loves or cares for her or thinks that she is this shining beacon of light in his light as long as it is dark? No, we say that's absurd. That's pushing it too far. And see, that's the whole point. If we take some of these things, metaphors, and we push them too far, or if we take parables, which are metaphors in an extended way, and push their details too far, things become absurd. Now, the occasion for this parable is a question about how far forgiveness will go. And the main point is God forgives way more than we do. So we should forgive the smaller stuff around us. God forgives a lot. We should at least forgive less. We aim to be like God in his radical forgiveness, right? That is the main point, okay? But some say, well, let's push this a little further because there's some other details. What about that little bit at the end where the king calls back the original servant and throws him in jail and tortures him for not forgiving his servant? I mean, that must just show that God will eventually punish all people in some pretty ugly and violent ways if they're not forgiving. But if we press these details and interpret them that way, we end up with the exact opposite conclusion that Jesus is trying to help Peter find. I mean, for example, the story starts with Jesus saying that we should forgive 77 times. In other words, he's telling Peter, stop trying to put a number on it. Stop looking for a limit. Just forgive people over and over with the measure that God has forgiven you. But if we're to press these details about the king at the end, are we to then think that this servant, forgiven once by the king, screws up, and that the king then will not forgive him a second time? I mean, we, Jesus says, are to forgive 77 times, but God, who's represented by the king here, can only forgive once? So is the point of the story then that God forgives at a lesser measure than we are supposed to as humans? And you see, this is the problem with pushing these details too far. Jesus is using common imagery to tell a subversive story. But if you push every little detail instead of looking for the main point, you might come away thinking that God forgives less while we forgive more. And that is the exact opposite of the point of the whole story. You see, the final scene may be intended to show the folly of unforgiveness, but to take it literally as God torturing those who don't forgive others is to use the final two verses to negate the bigger point of the entire story. And that's absurd. You see, instead of a God who is forgiving, ridiculously patient, radically loving, and gracious, if we interpret pushing those details too far, we come away fearful of a God waiting to haul us off for a single mistake. And this story has unfortunately often been preached, and it has been used then to scare people into some sort of behavior modification. And the whole point of the story has been twisted away from how great is the mercy and forgiveness of God to a fearful expectation of a God willing to zap you over one mistake. And when you begin to interpret parts of the text like this, it's no wonder that people have developed a bad view of God and religion today when they've heard that God is how people interpret the last two verses of this story. And I would say to interpret a story like this, a parable in this way, is irresponsible, and it can bring real harm. The final scene actually, instead of being read this way, might even be read in a better way as a more powerful move to readjust our thinking once more. And that's the final thing here that I'd like to point out about parables. And that is that the end is often messing with us even more. The whole point of the parable is to mess with you, to cause you to rethink things, right? From the very beginning, we're having a comparison story here that's causing us to reassess how we view things. But often at the end of the parable, there's one final thing that just messes with you more. Another opportunity to rethink. Now, we're uncomfortable with the end of the story because the image of the king calling back the servant and having him tortured. But it's important for us to know the hearers of this story originally probably didn't have that problem with that story. They didn't think that was weird because that's just how kings worked. That was just a part of their everyday life, and Jesus is telling a story with these details here that resonate so closely to their actual lives that the story is able to subversively change their thinking. It sounds to them a lot like how the world actually works. It's their culture. And the story works because it includes things that they easily accept while shaping them into things that challenge their imagination. But can you imagine the church later, after Jesus and Paul's day, reading back this story in the Gospel of Matthew as it's being circulated in the churches and thinking about it again? Can you imagine as they're reading this parable, after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, as the people begin to understand Jesus' mission to defeat evil with love and sacrifice rather than with coercion and violence? And imagine then from that perspective that they read again this parable that Jesus said about how the king at the end deals with the original servant. They read it more than from the perspective of us, and they think, that doesn't sound very much like the God we know in Jesus. Perhaps as they thought more on this story, the church again began to think, that doesn't seem like a very good ending. And then maybe they remembered Jesus' words just 2 chapters later, where he questions the whole idea of comparing God to a king at all. Matthew 20, verse 25, Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I mean, here, Jesus explicitly said, God is not like the kings and rulers in your culture. He doesn't coerce them. He doesn't lord over them. He doesn't use them for his own benefit. Instead, I have come to serve and to give my life for their benefit. I mean, he is upending the entire idea of comparing God to an earthly king or Caesar or president. And once you've read Matthew 20, you can't ever read Matthew 18 the same way again. Once you've read those words in Matthew 20, you can't ever read the end of the parable of the unforgiving servant the same way again. Because once you've read Matthew 20, you'll always stumble over the final act of the king in Matthew 18. Matthew 20 challenges your initial reading of Matthew 18. And this is good. This is Christ-like. You see, when we question the picture of the king at the end of this parable, it's not just that we're projecting our modern sensitivities back onto the text. That's not actually what's happening here. What we're doing is we are being shaped by the Spirit of Jesus himself. And now because of Jesus, we read that final scene differently because we know that's not the way God himself would do it. And truthfully, the rethinking of this scene isn't even something that has to be done by people much later. I actually even think the disciples back then, when Jesus is first telling this story, Peter himself, as kind of dumb as he seems to be at times, that perhaps even he picked up on this. As Jesus is telling the story, I could almost hear Peter saying something like, hey, Jesus, if the king was able to forgive $1 bazillion, why can't he forgive this servant again a second time for being kind of a dirtbag? And I can see Jesus begin to crack a smile and nod his head and say, is that what you would do, Peter? You see, in the end, this little story is a final challenge to the question of how far should forgiveness go? Because instead of answering it, it begs us to ask another question. Should we rethink how we view God in light of this? Should the end of the story be changed? And instead of the end of the story being an excuse for getting out of forgiveness, it actually becomes one final challenge to move us deeper into more radical forgiveness. And so perhaps that's a good place to end today. The story is calling us to be generous in our forgiveness. And maybe the deepest question it is asking is, who today can you forgive? Who owes you? Who's hurt you? Who have you been holding a grudge against? Who is it time to release of the debt and forgive? And then, what are your excuses for not doing it? Maybe easy in the past to have blamed God and say, well, God held their feet to the fire. I mean, the king here at the end has them tortured. I'm just following in the pattern of God. But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps the point here is to open us up to re-envisioning what God is actually like, to where we have to face the excuses we've been using to hold back forgiveness. Who can you forgive? God has forgiven you so very much. Who can you forgive? We're going to go to the communion table here, and Billy's going to play a song for us. We're going to remember the forgiveness that God offers us. We are, of course, thankful for how much God has forgiven us, but we are also inspired by his love and his forgiveness, and it also becomes a recommitment to living a life of love, self-sacrifice, and forgiveness as well. As we go to the communion table, as you take those elements here today, I pray that the love of God would do the work on your heart that would cause you to maybe see where you need to forgive today. Let me pray for you. God, thanks so much for today. Thanks that you love us so much. Thank you that you have forgiven us beyond what we could ever pay back. Even when we try to be earnest, there's really nothing we could do to pay you back for all that you've done for us. Thank you that you've offered us life free from debt. And as we go around our lives looking and seeing those who have been placed in our debt because of things they have done, we pray that you would give us, that you would shape us from the inside out, that you would cause us to be people who love indiscriminately, who forgive, who release people from their debts so that they might also experience the freedom we have experienced in you. We thank you, Jesus, for loving us, for coming, for becoming one of us, dying, and coming back to life. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Let's go to communion, and then we'll wrap up with some announcements.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up Till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. Sing that again. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. Yeah, yeah. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. In my life laid down, surrender now. I'll give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I'm gonna sing. I'm gonna sing. All my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. You are. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
Thanks, Billy. That's great. We got a couple announcements for you here today as we wrap up our time together. First of all, if you would like to give or to donate to the Pathways Church community, you can do that by going to our website at findpathways.com/donate, and you can make a one-time gift or a recurring gift there on our website, and we would appreciate that. There's so many of you that are giving, and we really could use the support as we're putting together these videos. We're trying to help people who are kind of ready to throw away God, religion, Christianity, and are perhaps just unaware that there's some other ways of thinking about things that might mean they can toss aside some old ways of thinking without throwing away Jesus himself. And so if you want to help us with that, you can support us financially, and we would really appreciate that. Today is graduation Sunday. We're really just celebrating with graduates in person, and if you know some graduates from our church community, you want to send them a little note and let them know that we're thinking of them and we're happy for them, and congratulations. That would be a great thing to do. Also, next week we are starting a new series called the Psalms Playlist, and we are going to be looking at Psalms, the book of Psalms. It's one of the most read parts of the Bible. There's some super interesting stuff in there. We're going to learn a little bit about how the Psalms came together, which is really important for understanding how we read them and use them today. And we are going to have a little fun this summer looking at different Psalms and putting together playlists. Each week there will be kind of a different theme, and you can put together a playlist of all sorts of songs, whatever genres you want. A mix of genres is fine, and we'll make those available each week as a playlist as well. And we'll be starting that next week, so it should be a lot of fun. Then coming up here in July, I know last week I said we are going to take July 2nd off as our summer break, which we normally do. But our friends at Zion were like, hey, we miss you guys. Let's hang out together. And they suggested we get together July 2nd and 9th. So we're going to do that. We're going to meet over at their building July 2nd and 9th. And we are going to meet with them again and do kind of some combined worship experience stuff together. And then the week of the 9th, following that Sunday, we're going to do like a big potluck thing and have some time just to kind of hang out with them and talk for a little bit. And so I just want you to put that on your radar. Then also in August, we're going to be going to an Everett Aqua Sox game. It is Julio Rodriguez bobblehead night. So the first how many ever people get there, get one of those. And tickets are $15, and we'll have a way for you to buy those here shortly. If you want to subscribe to our email newsletter, you can do that. You just got to email me. My email's on the screen, or you can message us on Facebook and just say, hey, here's my email address, and I would like to be added to the list. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for today. Been beautiful outside. It's supposed to be really nice again this week. I know you graduates are out of school, but everybody else has got a couple weeks left, but they're in the end of this thing. So hopefully you are enjoying the beautiful weather, the push to the final end of the school year, and hopefully we'll see you back here next week as we start our Psalm series. Okay? All right. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye.